Chapter 5. The abbot made his evening tour of the Franciscan monastery, spurring his lazy, good-for-nothing monks to earn their daily bread. He checked the bins in the holy relic workshop and visited the bakery turning out huge crusty loaves for nearby towns. He inspected the produce garden and the bamboo baskets filled to the brim with olives, tomatoes, and grapes, looking for bruises on their satiny skins. His monks were also busy elves, though not so merry. In fact, they were a sullen crew, with none of the joy necessary to serve God. The abbot took a long black cheroot from beneath his cassock and strolled around the monastery grounds to sharpen his appetite for the evening meal. It was then that he saw Aspano Pisciotta drag Turi Guiliano through the monastery gates. The gatekeeper tried to keep them out, but Pisciotta put a pistol to his tonsured head and he fell to his knees to say his last prayers. Pisciotta deposited Giuliano's bloody, almost lifeless, body at the abbot's feet. The abbot was a tall, emaciated man with an elegant monkey-like face, all tiny bones, a nub of a nose and queering little brown button for eyes. Though 70 years of age, he was vigorous, his mind as sharp and cunning as in the old days before Mussolini, when he had written elegant ransom notes for mafia kidnappers who employed him. Now that it was known to all, peasants and authorities alike, that his monastery was the headquarters of black market operators and smugglers, he was never interfered with in his illegal activities. This out of respect for his holy calling, and a feeling that he deserved some material reward for his spiritual guidance to the community. So the abbot Manfredi was not dismayed to find 2 peasant scoundrels covered with blood breaking into the sacred domain of St. Francis. In fact, he knew Pisciotta well. He had used the young man in a few smuggling and black market operations. They had in common a sly cunning that delighted them both, one surprised to find it in a man so old and holy, the other to find it in one so young and unworldly. The abbot reassured the gatekeeper monk, then said to Pisciotta, "Well, my dear Aspano, what mischief are you into now?" Pisciotta was tightening the shirt around Giuliano's wound. The abbot was surprised to see that his face was grief-stricken. He did not think the lad was capable of such emotion. Pisciotta, seeing again that huge wound, was sure his friend was going to die. And how could he tell the news to Turi's mother and father? He dreaded Maria Lombardo's grief. But for now, a more important scene would have to be played. He must convince the abbot to give Giuliano sanctuary in the monastery. He looked the abbot straight in the eye. He wanted to convey a message that would not be a direct threat, but would make the priest understand that if he refused, that he would make a mortal enemy. "This is my cousin and dearest friend, Salvatore Giuliano," Pisciotta said. "As you can see, he has been unfortunate, and in a short time the national police will be all over the mountains looking for him. And for me, you are our only hope. I beg you to hide us and send for a doctor. Do this for me and you have a friend forever." He emphasized the word friend. None of this escaped the abbot. He understood perfectly. He had heard of this young Giuliano, a brave boy well respected in Montelepre, a great shooter and hunter, manlier than his years. Even the friends of the friends had their eyes on him as a possible recruit. The great Don Croce himself, on a social and business visit to the monastery, had mentioned his name to the abbot as someone it might be profitable to cultivate. But studying the unconscious Giuliano, he was almost sure that this man would need a grave rather than a sanctuary, a priest to administer the last rites rather than the doctor. There was very little risk in granting Pisciotta's request. Giving sanctuary to a corpse was not a crime even in Sicily, but he did not want to let this young man know that the favor he was about to do had such little value. He said, "And why are they searching for you?" Pisciotta hesitated. If the abbot knew that a policeman was dead, he might refuse them sanctuary. But if he were unprepared for the search that was sure to come, he might be surprised into betraying them. He decided to tell the truth. He did it so very quickly. The abbot lowered his eyes in sorrow for another soul lost to hell and to study closely Giuliano's unconscious form. Blood was leaking through the shirt tied around his body. Perhaps the poor lad would die as they talked, and solve the whole problem. As a Franciscan monk, the abbot was filled with Christian charity, but in these terrible times he had to consider the practical and material consequences of his merciful deeds. If he gave sanctuary and the boy died, he could only come out with a profit. The authorities would be satisfied with the corpse. The family would be forever in his debt. If Giuliano recovered, his gratitude might be even more valuable. A man who could, while grievously wounded, still fire his pistol and kill a policeman was a man worth having in your debt. He could, of course, deliver both of these rascals to the national police, who would then make short work of them. But what would be the profit? The authorities could do no more for him than they were doing now. The area in which they held power was already secure to him. It was on the other side of the fence he needed friends. Betraying these youngsters would only earn him enemies among the peasants and the undying hatred of two families. The abbot was not so foolish as to think his cassock could protect him from the vendetta that would surely follow. And also he had read Pisciotta's mind. This was a young fellow who would go far before he trod the road to hell. No, the hatred of the peasant Sicilian could never be taken lightly. True Christians, they would never shame a statue of the Virgin Mary. But in the hot blood of vendetta they would shotgun the Pope himself for breaking Omerta, an ancient code of silence to any authority. In this land with its countless statues of Jesus, there was no belief in the doctrine of turning the other cheek. In this benighted land forgiveness was the refuge of the coward. The Sicilian peasant did not know the meaning of mercy. Of one thing he was sure: Pisciotta would never betray him. In one of their little smuggling deals, the abbot had arranged for Pisciotta to be arrested and interrogated. The interrogator, a member of the Palermo security police, not one of the carabinieri blockheads, had been subtle and then blunt. But neither cunning nor cruelty had moved Pisciotta. He had remained silent. The interrogator released him and assured the abbot that this was a lad who could be trusted with important errands. Since then the abbot had always held a special place in his heart for Aspano Pisciotta, and often said a prayer for his soul. The abbot put 2 fingers in his bony shrunken mouth and whistled. Monks came running, and the abbot instructed them to carry Giuliano into a far wing of the monastery, the abbot's own special quarters where he had hidden deserters, sons of rich farmers, from the Italian army during the war. Then he sent one of his monks for the doctor in the village of San Giuseppe Giotto, only 5 miles away. Pisciotta sat on the bed and held his friend's hand. The wound was no longer bleeding, and Turi Guiliano's eyes were open, but there was a glaze over them. Pisciotta, almost in tears, did not dare to speak. He wiped Giuliano's forehead, which was running with perspiration. There was a blue tinge to the skin. It was an hour before the doctor arrived, and, having observed the horde of carabinieri scouring the mountainside, was not surprised that his friend, the abbot, was concealing a wounded man. This did not concern him. Who cared about the police and government? The abbot was a fellow Sicilian who needed help, and who always sent him a basket of eggs on Sunday, a barrel of wine for Christmas, and a young lamb for Holy Easter. The doctor examined Giuliano and dressed the wound. The bullet had gone through the belly and probably torn up some vital organs, certainly hit the liver. A great deal of blood had been lost. The young lad had a ghostly pallor. The skin all over his body was bluish white. Around the mouth was that circle of white the doctor knew so well as the one of first signals of death. He sighed and said to the abbot, "I've done all I can. The bleeding has stopped, but he's already lost more than a third of his blood, and that's usually fatal. Keep him warm. Feed him a little milk, and I'll leave you some morphine." He looked down at Giuliano's powerful body with regret. Pisciotta whispered, "What can I tell his father and mother? Is there a chance for him?" The doctor sighed. "Tell them what you like, but the wound is mortal. He's a strong-looking lad, so he may live a few days more, but it's wise not to hope." He saw the look of despair in Pesciola's eyes and the fleeting look of relief on the abbot's face, and said with ironic humor, "Of course, in this holy place there could always be a miracle." The abbot and the doctor went out. Pesciola leaned over his friend to wipe the sweat from his brow, and was astonished that in Giuliano's eyes was a hint of mockery. These eyes were dark brown, but edged with a circle of silver. Pesciola leaned closer. Turi Guiliano was whispering. It was a struggle for him to speak. "Tell my mother I will come home," Turi said. And then he did something Pesciola would never forget in the years to follow. His hands came up suddenly and grabbed Pesciola by the hair of his head. The hands were powerful. They could never be the hands of a dying man. They yanked Pesciola's head down close. "Obey me," Giuliano said. The morning after Giuliano's parents called him, Hector Adonis arrived in Montelepre. He rarely used his house in Montelepre. He hated the place of his birth in his young manhood. He especially avoided the festa. The decorations always distressed him. Their brightness seemed to him some evil disguise for the poverty of the town, and he had always endured humiliations during the festa, drunken men jeering at his short stature, women giving him amused, contemptuous smiles. It did not help that he knew so much more than they did. They were so proud, for instance, that every family painted its house the same color their fathers had. They did not know that the color of the houses gave away their origins, the blood they had inherited from their ancestors along with their houses. That centuries ago the Normans had painted their houses white. The Greeks always used blue, the Arabs various pinks and red, and the Jews used yellow. Now they all considered themselves Italian and Sicilian. The blood had become so intermingled in 1,000 years that you could not identify the owner of a house by its features. And if you told the owner of a yellow house that he had Jew ancestors, you could get a knife in your belly. Aspano Pesciola lived in a white house, though he looked more like an Arab. The Giuliano's was predominantly Grecian blue, and Turi Giuliano's face was truly Greek, though he had the body of the lusty large-boned Normans. But apparently all the blood had boiled together into something strange and dangerous to make the true Sicilian, and that was what brought Adonis to Montelepre today. The Via Bella was straddled at each corner by a pair of carabinieri, grim-faced, holding rifles and machine pistols at the ready. The second day of the festa was beginning, but this part of town was curiously deserted and there were no children on the street. Hector Adonis parked his car in front of the Giuliano house, on the strip of sidewalk. A pair of carabinieri watched him suspiciously until he got out of the car, then smiled with amusement at his short stature. It was Pesciola who opened the door and led him inside. Giuliano's mother and father were in the kitchen waiting, a breakfast of cold sausage, bread and coffee on the table. Maria Lombardo was calm, reassured by her beloved Aspano that her son would recover. She was more angry than fearful. Giuliano's father looked more proud than sad. His son had proved himself a man. He was alive and his enemy was dead. Again Pesciola told his story, this time with comforting humor. He made light of Giuliano's wound and very little of his own heroism in carrying Giuliano down to the monastery. But Hector Adonis knew that helping an injured man over 3 miles of rough terrain must have been grueling for the slightly built Pesciola. Also, he thought Pesciola skipped over the description of the wound too glibly. Adonis feared the worst. "How did the carabinieri know enough to come here?" he asked. Pesciola told him about Giuliano giving up his identity card. Giuliano's mother broke out in lamentation. "Why didn't Turi let them have the cheese? Why did he fight?" Giuliano's father said harshly to his wife, "What would you have him do? Inform on that poor farmer? He would have disgraced the family name forever." Hector Adonis was struck by the contradiction in these remarks. He knew the mother was much stronger and more fiery than the father. And Pesciola, this boy Aspano, who would have thought he would be so brave, to rescue his comrade and bring him to safety? and now lying so coolly to the parents about the hurt their son had suffered. Giuliano's father said, if he had not given up his identity card, our friends would have sworn he was in the streets here. Giuliano's mother said, they would have arrested him anyway. She began to weep. Now he will have to live in the mountains. Hector Adonis said, we must make certain the abbot does not deliver him to the police. Pisciotta said impatiently, he will not dare. He knows I'll hang him in his cassock. Adonis gave Pisciotta a long look. There was a deadly menace in this young boy. He was not intelligent to damage the ego of a young man, Adonis thought. The police never understood that you can, with some impunity, insult an older man who has already been humiliated by life itself and will not take to heart the small slights of another human being. But a young man thinks these offenses mortal. They were looking for help to Hector Adonis, who had helped their son in the past. Hector said, if the police learn his whereabouts, the abbot will have no choice. He is not above suspicion himself in certain matters. I think it best, with your permission, to ask my friend Don Croce Malo to intercede with the abbot. They were surprised that he knew the great Don, except for Pisciotta, who gave him a knowing smile. Adonis said to him sharply, and what are you doing here? You'll be recognized and arrested. They have your description. Pisciotta said contemptuously, the two guards were scared shitless. They wouldn't recognize their mothers, and I have a dozen witnesses who will swear I was in Montelepre yesterday. Hector Adonis adopted his most imposing professional manner. He said to the parents, you must not attempt to visit your son or tell anyone, even your dearest friends, where he is. The police have informers and spies everywhere. Aspano will visit Turi at night. As soon as he can move, I'll make arrangements for him to live in another town until this all quiets down. Then, with some money, things can be arranged, and Turi can come home. Don't worry about him, Maria. Guard your health. And you, Aspano, keep me informed. He embraced the mother and father. Maria Lombardo was still weeping when he left. He had many things to do, most importantly to get word to Don Croce and make sure that Turi's sanctuary remained safe. Thank God the government in Rome didn't offer rewards for information on the murder of a policeman, or the abbot would have sold Turi as quickly as he sold one of his holy relics. Turi Guiliano lay on the bed without moving. He had heard the doctor pronounce his wound mortal, but he could not believe he was dying. His body seemed suspended in air, free of pain and fear. He could never die. He did not know the great loss of blood produces euphoria. During the days, one of the monks tended him, fed him milk. Evenings, the abbot came with the doctor. Pisciotta visited him in the night and held his hand and nursed him through the long evil hours of darkness. At the end of 2 weeks, the doctor proclaimed a miracle. Turi Guiliano had willed his body to heal, to materialize the lost blood, to meld together the vital organs that had been torn by the steel-jacketed bullet. And in the euphoria inspired by the draining of the blood from his body, he dreamed of future glory. He felt a new freedom, that he could no longer be held accountable for anything he did from this time on, that the laws of society, the stricter Sicilian laws of family, could no longer bind him, that he was free to commit any act, that his bloody wound made him innocent, and all this because a foolish carabinier had shot him over a piece of cheese. For the weeks of his convalescence, he played over and over in his mind the days he and his fellow villagers had congregated in the town square waiting for the gabilotti, the overseers of the large land estates, to pick them out for a day's work, offering starvation wages with the contemptuous take-it-or-leave-it sneer of men who had all the power, the unfair sharing of crops that had left everyone impoverished after a year's hard work, the overbearing hand of the law which punished the poor and let the rich go free. If he recovered from this wound, he swore he would see justice done. He would never again be a powerless boy at the mercy of fate. He would arm himself, physically and mentally. Of one thing he was sure, he would never again stand helpless before the world, as he had before Guido Quintana and the policeman who had shot him down. The young man who had been Turi Guiliano no longer existed. At the end of a month, the doctor advised another 4 weeks of rest with some exercise, and so Guiliano donned a monk's habit and strolled around the grounds of the monastery. The abbot had become fond of the young man, and often accompanied him, telling stories about his youthful travels to far-off lands. The abbot's affection was not lessened when Hector Adonis sent him a sum of money for his prayers for the poor, and Don Croce himself advised the abbot that he had an interest in the young man. As for Guiliano, he was astonished at how these monks lived, in a countryside where people were almost starving, where laborers had to sell their sweat for 50 cents a day. The monks of St. Francis lived like kings. The monastery was a really huge and rich estate. They had a lemon orchard, a scattering of stout olive trees as old as Christ. They had a small bamboo plantation and a butcher shop into which they fed their flock of sheep, their pen of piglets. Chickens and turkeys roamed at will, crowds of them. The monks ate meat every day with their spaghetti, drank homemade wine from their huge cellar, and traded on the black market for tobacco, which they smoked like fiends. But they worked hard. During the day they labored barefoot in cassocks tucked up to their knees, sweat pouring down their brows. On their tonsured heads, to protect them from the sun, they wore oddly shaped American fedoras, black and brown, which the abbot had acquired from some military government supply officer for a cask of wine. The monks wore the fedoras in many different styles, some with the brims snapped down, gangster style, others with the brims flapped upward all round to form gutters in which they kept their cigarettes. The abbot had come to hate these hats and had forbidden their use except when actually working in the fields. For the second 4 weeks, Guiliano was a fellow monk. To the abbot's astonishment, he worked hard in the fields and helped the older monks carry the heavy baskets of fruits and olives back to the storage shed. As he grew well, Guiliano enjoyed the work, enjoyed showing off his strength. They piled his baskets high and he never let his knees buckle. The abbot was proud of him and told him he could stay as long as he liked, that he had the makings of a true man of God. Turi Guiliano was happy that 4 weeks. He had, after all, returned from the dead in body, and in his head he was weaving daydreams and miracles. And he enjoyed the old abbot, who treated him with absolute trust and revealed the secrets of the monastery to him. The old man boasted that all the products of the monastery were sold directly on the black market, not turned over to the government warehouses, except for the wine, which was swilled down by the monks themselves. At night there was a great deal of gambling and drunkenness, and even women were smuggled in. But to all this the abbot closed his eyes. "These are hard times," he said to Guiliano. "The promised reward of heaven is too far away. Men must have some pleasure now. God will forgive them." One rainy afternoon, the abbot showed Turi another wing of the monastery which was used as a warehouse. This was overflowing with holy relics manufactured by a skilled team of old monks. The abbot, like any shopkeeper, bewailed hard times. "Before the war, we had a very good business," he sighed. "This warehouse was never more than half full. And just look what sacred treasures we have here. A bone from the fish multiplied by Christ, the staff carried by Moses on his way to the promised land." He paused to watch Guiliano's astonished face with amused satisfaction. Then his bony face contorted into a wicked grin. Kicking a huge pile of wooden sticks, he almost said gleefully, "This used to be our best item. Hundreds of pieces of the cross on which our Lord was crucified. And in this bin are fragments of any saint you can name. There isn't a household in Sicily that doesn't have the bone of a saint. And locked away in a special storeroom we have 13 arms of St. Andrew, 3 heads of John the Baptist, and 7 suits of armor worn by Joan of Arc. In the winter, our monks travel far and wide to sell these treasures." Turi Guiliano was laughing now, and the abbot smiled at him. But Guiliano was thinking how the poor were always deceived. even by those who pointed the road to salvation. It was another important fact to remember. The abbot showed him a huge tub full of medallions blessed by the Cardinal of Palermo, 30 shrouds that Jesus wore when he died, and 2 black Virgin Marys. That stopped Turi Guiliano's laughter. He told the abbot about the Black Virgin statue owned by his mother and so treasured by her since she was a little girl, that it had been in her family for generations. Could it possibly be a forgery? The abbot patted him kindly on the shoulder and told him the monastery had been making replicas for over 100 years carved from good olive wood, but he assured Guiliano that even the replicas had value, since only a few were made. The abbot saw no harm confiding in a murderer such venial sins of holy men. Still, Guiliano's disapproving silence disturbed the abbot. Defensively, he said, "Remember that we men who devote our lives to God must also live in the material world of men who do not believe in waiting for their rewards in heaven. We too have families and must aid and protect them. Many of our monks are poor and come from the poor, who we know are the salt of the earth. We cannot permit our sisters and brothers, our nephews and cousins to starve in these hard times. The Holy Church itself needs our help, must defend itself against powerful enemies. The communists and socialists, those misguided liberals, must be fought against. And that takes money. What a comfort to Mother Church are the faithful. Their need for our holy relics supplies the money to crush the infidels and fills a need in their own souls. If we did not supply them, they would waste their money on gambling and wine and shameful women. Don't you agree?" Guiliano nodded, but he was smiling. It was dazzling for one so young to meet such a master of hypocrisy. The abbot was irritated by that smile. He had expected a more gracious response from a murderer to whom he had given sanctuary and nursed back from the gate of death. Grateful respect dictated a properly hypocritical response to the utmost sincerity. This smuggler, this murderer, this peasant, Master Turi Guiliano, should show himself more understanding, more a Christian. The abbot said sternly, "Remember, our true faith rests on our belief in miracles." "Yes," Guiliano said, "and I know with all my heart that it is your duty to help us find them." He said it without malice, in a spirit of fun, with a sincere good will to please his benefactor. But it was all he could do to keep from laughing outright. The abbot was pleased, and all his affection returned. This was a fine fellow. He had enjoyed his company the past few months, and it was comforting to know that the man was deeply in his debt. And he would not be ungrateful. He had already shown a noble heart. He expressed in word and deed, every day, his respect and gratitude to the abbot. He did not have the hard heart of an outlaw. What would happen to such a man in this present-day Sicily, full of informers, poverty, bandits, and sundry sinners? Ah well, the abbot thought, a man who has murdered once can do it again, in a pinch. The abbot decided that Don Croce should counsel Turi Guiliano on the right path to life. One day, while resting on his bed, Turi Guiliano had a strange visitor. The abbot presented him as Father Benjamino Malo, a very dear friend, then left them alone together. Father Benjamino said solicitously, "My dear young man, I hope you have recovered from your wound. The holy abbot tells me it was truly a miracle." Guiliano said politely, "God's mercy," and Father Benjamino bowed his head as if he himself had received that benediction. Guiliano studied him. This was a priest who had never labored in the fields. His cassock was too clean at the hem, his face too puffily white, his hands too soft. But the countenance was holy enough. It was meek and had a Christ-like resignation, a Christian humility. The voice, too, was soft and gentle when Father Benjamino said, "My son, I will hear your confession and give you Holy Communion. Shriven of sin, you can go out into the world with a pure heart." Turi Guiliano studied this priest who wielded such sublime power. "Forgive me, Father," he said. "I am not yet in a state of contrition, and it will be false of me to make a confession at this time. But thank you for your blessing." The priest nodded and said, "Yes, that would compound your sins. But I have another offer that is perhaps more practical in this world. My brother, Don Croce, has sent me to ask if you would like to take refuge with him in Villaba. You would be paid a good wage, and, of course, as you must know, the authorities would never dare molest you while you are under his protection." Giuliano was astonished that word of his deed had reached such a man as Don Croce. He knew he had to be careful. He detested the mafia, and did not wish to be caught in their web. "This is a very great honor," he said. "I thank you and your brother, but I must consult with my family. I must honor the wishes of my parents. So for now permit me to refuse your kind offer." He saw the priest was surprised. Who in Sicily would refuse the protection of the great Don? So he added, "Perhaps in a few weeks I will think differently and come to see you in Villaba." Father Benjamino had recovered. He raised his hands in benediction. "Go with God, my son," he said. "You will always be welcome in my brother's house." He made the sign of a cross and left. Turi Guiliano knew it was time to leave. When Aspano Pisciota came to visit that evening, Giuliano instructed him on what preparations to make for his return to the outside world. He saw that he had changed. So had his friend. Pisciota did not flinch or make any protest at receiving orders that he knew would profoundly alter his life. Finally, Giuliano told him, "Aspano, you can come with me or you can remain with your family. Do what you feel you must do." Pisciota smiled. "Do you think I'm going to let you have all the fun and glory? Let you play in the mountains while I bring donkeys out to work and pick olives? And what about our friendship? Am I to let you live in the mountains alone when we have played and worked together since we were children? Only when you return to Montelepre in freedom will I return there too. So no more foolish talk. I'll come to get you in 4 days. It will take a little time to do all you want me to do." Pisciota was busy those 4 days. He had already tracked down the smuggler on horseback who had offered to go after the wounded Giuliano. His name was Marcuzzi, and he was a feared man and a large-scale smuggler operating under the protection of Don Croce and Guido Quintana. He had an uncle of the same name who was a great mafia chief. Pisciota discovered that Marcuzzi made regular trips from Montelepre to Castellamare. Pisciota knew the farmer who kept the smuggler's mules, and when he saw the animals taken out of the fields and brought back to the barn near the town, he gambled that Marcuzzi was making a trip the next day. At dawn, Pisciota stationed himself along the road that he knew Marcuzzi had to take, and waited for him. He had a lupara, which many Sicilian families owned as part of their household equipment. Indeed, the deadly Sicilian shotgun was so common and so often used for assassination that when Mussolini cleaned out the mafia, he had ordered all stone walls to be knocked down to at most 3 feet in height so that murderers could not use the walls as ambush points. He had decided to kill Marcuzzi not only because the smuggler had offered to help the police kill the wounded Giuliano, but because he had also boasted of it to his friends. By killing the smuggler, he would give warning to any others who might betray Giuliano. Also, he needed the weapons he knew Marcuzzi carried. He did not have to wait long, because Marcuzzi was leading empty mules to pick up black market goods in Castellamare. He was careless. He rode his lead mule down a mountain trail with his rifle slung over his shoulder, instead of at the ready. When he saw Pisciota standing in the trail in front of him, he was not alarmed. All he saw was a short, slender boy with a thin, dandyish mustache who was smiling in a way that irritated him. It was only when Pisciota swung the lupara out from beneath his jacket that Marcuzzi paid full attention. He said gruffly, "You've got me going in the wrong way. I haven't picked up my goods yet, and these mules are under the protection of the friends of the friends. Be clever and find yourself another customer." Pisciota said softly, "I only want your life." He smiled cruelly. There was a day you wanted to be a hero for the police. Just a few months ago. Do you remember?" Marcuzzi remembered. He turned the mule sideways, as if by accident, to shield his hand from Pescioda's gaze. He slid his hand into his belt and drew his pistol. At the same time, he yanked on the mule's bridle to bring himself around in a shooting position. The last thing he saw was Pescioda's smile as the Lupara blasted his body out from the saddle and flung it into the dust. With grim satisfaction, Pescioda stood over the body and fired another blast into the head, then took the pistol still in Marcuzzi's hand and the rifle wrapped around the body by his sling. He emptied the man's jacket pocket of rifle bullets and put them in his own. Then quickly and methodically he shot each of the 4 mules, a warning to anyone who might help the enemies of Giuliano, even indirectly. He stood on the road, his Lupara in his arms, the dead man's rifle slung over his shoulder, the pistol in his waistband. He felt no sense of pity, and his ferocity pleased him. For despite his love for his friend, they had always striven against each other in many ways. And though he acknowledged Turi as his chief, he always felt he had to prove his claim to their friendship by being as courageous and as clever. Now he too had stepped out of the magic circle of boyhood, of society, and joined Turi on the outside of that circle. With this act he had bound himself forever to Turi Guiliano. 2 days later, just before the evening meal, Giuliano left the monastery. He embraced all of the monks as they gathered in the eating hall and thanked them for their kindness. The monks were sorry to see him go. True, he had never attended their religious rites, and had never made a confession and act of contrition for the murder he had committed. But some of these monks had started their manhood with similar crimes and were not judgmental. The abbot escorted Giuliano to the gate of the monastery where Pescioda was waiting. He presented him with a going-away gift. It was a statue of the Black Virgin Mary, a duplicate of the one owned by Maria Lombardo, Giuliano's mother. Pescioda had an American green duffel bag, and Giuliano put the Black Virgin Mary statuette into it. Pescioda watched with a sardonic eye as the abbot and Giuliano said their goodbyes. He knew the abbot to be a smuggler, a secret member of the Friends of the Friends, and a slave-driving taskmaster with his poor monks, so he could not understand the sentimentality of the abbot's farewell. It did not occur to Pescioda that the love and affection and respect that Giuliano inspired in him he could inspire in as powerful and as old as a man as the abbot. Though the abbot's affection was genuine, it was tinged with self-interest. He knew this boy might one day become a force to reckon with in Sicily. It was like spotting the trace of godliness. As for Turi Guiliano, he was genuinely grateful. The abbot had saved his life, but more than that, had instructed him in many things and had been a delightful companion. The abbot had even let him have the use of his library. Curiously, Giuliano had affection for the abbot's chicanery. It seemed to him a nice balance to strike in life, the doing of good without doing great visible harm, the balancing of power to make life go smoothly. The abbot and Turi Guiliano embraced each other. Turi said, "I am in your debt. Remember me when you need help of any kind. Whatever you ask, I must do." The abbot patted his shoulder. "Christian charity does not require repayment," he said. "Return to the ways of God, my son, and pay his tribute." But he was speaking by rote. He knew well this kind of innocence in the young. Out of it a devil could rise in flames to do his bidding. He would remember Giuliano's promise. Giuliano shouldered the duffel bag despite Pescioda's protest, and they walked through the monastery gate together. They never looked back.